Dust rose on the territory of the destroyed castle. Looking around the wreckage of the building, Charles noted that she understood what a battle between demigods was like. Putting her hand in her pocket, she and her group walked forward. With an agitated expression on her face and her thoughts, Charles said that she did not know for what reasons there were disagreements among them, adding that this was a completely different level. Continuing to think, she noted that even if all living beings in this world combine their strength, they can win. Wary, she wondered if they had the power to do anything against them. Suddenly, the circle members' eyes were drawn to Lucas, who was floating in the air. Looking at the main character, whose gaze was shrouded in cold, Charles thought that it was the Apostle of the Sword. Crying out, Jerome declared that this was their chance, wondering if their opponent was just an apostle, suggesting that they all attack him together and get information. Turning to Jerome, who had turned around, Shepard said that he didn't think it was a matter that could be discussed so easily, adding that they needed to leave it to him to begin with. Shepard's face was shrouded in worry. Rising into the air, he appeared before Lucas. Taken aback, he tried to find out if the main character was Kane Lixton, believing that he knew who they were. Looking at the main character, Shepard said that he would ask only one question. Lowering his hands, he tried to find out if Lucas was their enemy. Lowering his head, the main character froze in one position. With a serious expression on his face, Shepard said that they had already found out that Lucas was the Apostle of the Sword. Continuing to float in the air, he noted that Ricky began to create chaos in relation to the other demigods, asking if the main character had freed the subordinates who were there. Shepard felt that Lux was completely different from the demigods and apostles they knew about. Worried, Shepard asked Lucas to answer whether they should really treat him as their enemy. Lost in thought, Lucas lowered his head. His gaze fell on the nearby members of the circle. Next, the main character drew attention to Heinz looking at him. After which, Lucas's face turned into a grin. Heinz was shocked by what he saw. The main character's body was covered with powerful flames. Horrified, Jerome called Lucas a breath. Looking at the cloud of dust that had appeared, Jerome asked the guys to look at it. As Jerome rushed to attack Lucas, he wondered if he had said that. His weapon almost overtook the main character's body. Suddenly, Lucas's body was enveloped in a magical barrier. The faces of the circle members were filled with excitement. Raising her head, Charles reported the lightning strike, wondering how to use the sword posts. The streams of aura that arose around the main character continued to sparkle. A sound was heard around the barrier. From what he saw, Shepard's face was covered with bewilderment. With a stunned look, Charles noted Lucas's ability to control mana. Baring her teeth, she stared ahead. Straightening her arms, Charles activated the space capture. Looking at the main character, she guessed that he was a magician who had reached the 8-star level. Heinz was shocked by what he saw. His gaze fell on Lucas hovering nearby. Taken aback, the main character turned in his direction. A bead of sweat slowly dripped from Heinz's face. Charles raised her finger to her mouth and bit it. Baring her teeth, she rushed to the attack. With a wave of her hand, Charles directed a stream of blood towards Lucas. Wary, the main character also bit his finger. Spreading his hands, he created a magical barrier in front of him. Horrified in his thoughts, the man noted that not only does Lucas use magic and divine powers at the same time, he can also summon a demon. The scene of the fierce battle was covered in a purple aura, a cloud of dark energy formed in it. After which, demons appeared from these clumps. Smirking, Riley's noted that they had not seen Azura for 100 years. Indignant, Azura asked her not to make him laugh, saying that just a few days ago she appeared in the dream of the person who signed the contract with him. Averting her gaze, Riley's wondered what he was talking about. Putting his fist to his palm, Azura said that this was even better, adding that he still wanted to give Riley's a good beating once. Raising her finger, Riley stated that Azura was still talking nonsense, trying to see if he would help relieve her fatigue for the first time in a long time. After which, the demons rushed into battle. As they collided, a powerful explosion was heard. With her arms outstretched, Charles stood in front of the circle members. Turning to the nearby members of the circle, Charles asked them to leave, saying that they would only get in the way. Indignant, Jerome tried to object. Then, Charles wondered if she should repeat herself twice. Moving around, she stated that she told them to disappear. Averting his gaze, Shepard communicated that they understood, asking her to be careful. After this, the members of the circle left the battlefield. Smiling, Charles noted that she didn't think Lucas would let them go so easily. With a mischievous smile, she suggested that the main character was rather relaxed. With a serious expression on his face, the protagonist stated that she was his target from the very beginning. Wary, Charles froze in one position. Her eye was shrouded in a mysterious aura. When her eyes read, she ordered Lucas to tell her everything that happened between the demigods. Looking surprised at Charles, the main character asked her not to relax. Smirking, he wondered if he really looked like someone capable of succumbing to such a simple spell, noting that Charles had already tried it on him once and should be well aware of it. Baring her teeth, Charles thought that soul capture did not work on Lucas at all, noting that this was exactly what Riley's had said. Continuing to observe the main character, she thought that his fortitude was not at the human level. Lowering her gaze, Charles wondered if Lucas had said that she had been his target all along, asking what that meant. With his hands folded, the main character tried to find out Charles's age, calling her grandmother. In turn, Charles asked to use only one thing, saying that otherwise he was a corpse. Enveloping his hand in a stream of aura, Lucas said that the forces of his family were devoted to the connections of the higher and lower, asking if this was so. Smirking, he stated that he wanted to subjugate her and make her his subordinate. With a distraught look, Charles called him a pathetic worm, suggesting that because Lucas lived too little, he was still not smart at all. Wings began to sprout from Charles's back. Her eyes were enveloped in a red glow. Flapping her wings, she made a powerful push. From the emerging shadow, many bats appeared. A horde of bats headed towards the main character. Averting his gaze, he guessed that Charles liked the fight of attrition more than he realized. A horde of bats enveloped Lucas from all sides. Suddenly, the protagonist's hand broke out of her bonds. Looking it out, Lucas clenched his fist, after which, a powerful explosion occurred. Holding his fist above himself, the main character froze in one position. Shielding her body with her arms, Charles bared her teeth. Behind Lucas, many sparks of aura could be seen. With a look full of hatred, Charles called the main character a brat. Stretching her arms forward, she formed two purple spheres in front of her. The silhouette of an angry monster appeared before Lucas' gaze. The monster's teeth stuck into the magical barrier that the main character created. Turning around, Lucas guessed it was a hellhound. Cracks began to form on the walls of the barrier. After breaking through the barrier, the hellhound attempted to attack Lucas. Jumping to the side, the hellhound grabbed the ground with its claws. Raising her tail, she gradually began to approach the main character. An army of monsters was visible behind Charles, smirking. Lucas told about an evil spirit, a nightmare and 3 whole demons, noting that Charles was truly incredible, calling her granny. Stretching her hand forward, Charles noted that she had warned him not to continue. A horde of monsters rushed towards Lucas. A cloud of aura began to form in his hands. At that moment, a cloud of smoke hung in the sky, from which flames could be seen. Having dodged the hellhound's attack, the protagonist raised his hand forward. The faces of the monsters were enveloped in a powerful stream of light. Charles was shocked by what she saw. Lucas's eyes were filled with a bright light. A powerful explosion occurred at the site of a fierce battle. Shards of stone scattered to the sides. At that moment, a huge hole formed in the ground. In that very hole was the main character, frozen in one position. A huge cloud of dust could be seen around him. A mysterious creature was visible in its shadow. Lucas's face was covered in a grin. Due to the fact that the main character put his foot on Charles's chest, she let out a scream. Looking at the angry Cheryl, Lucas noted that she was quite skilled, adding that her attack patterns were too hackneyed, again calling her granny. Indignant, Charles asked her to stop. Turning away, the main character said that from the very beginning he had not intended to kill them. Touching her stomach, Charles wondered what he was up to, noting that he had provoked them in the first place. With his back to her, Lucas stated that he only wanted to test their abilities and see if they were up to the task of standing up to the demigods. Taken aback, Charles tried to find out if he wanted to say that he was going to fight with the demigods. Looking at Lucas's back, she wondered if he thought she would believe it, declaring that he had sold out his beliefs and become a supporter of the demigods. Looking surprised at Charles, the main character said that he was not inviting her to believe but only telling her to accept it. Turning around, Lucas noted that he was stronger than them. In a place where everything was shrouded in snow, the silhouette of a lord could be seen. Standing next to the ice blocks, seeing something, the lord froze in one position. His gaze fell on the silhouette of an unknown woman. The girl's hair fluttered due to powerful wind currents. Looking towards the girl, the lord noted that they had not seen each other for a long time. Turning his attention to the blue-haired girl, the lord called her Elia. Looking around her domain, Elia wondered if she had warned the lord not to break into her territory like that. Lowering his hands, the lord announced that Ricky had died. Elia was shocked by what she heard. In turn, the lord stated that he killed him. Looking at the lord's back, Elia tried to find out what kind of nonsense he was talking about, asking why this happened. Opening his mouth slightly, the lord said that the reason for this was that Ricky had betrayed them. Turning his attention to the alarmed Elia, he said that dozens of brothers had died, adding that he only punished Ricky as he should have. Alerted, Elia froze in one position. Looking at the annoyed lord, she wondered why the face of the person who did this looked so bad. Raising his head, the lord asked Elia to adopt what Ricky was doing. Indignant, she declared that the lord must know her answer, even if she uttered it, ordering him to leave. The lord's face was shrouded in anger. At that moment, looking at his mouth, she heard something important. His lips froze in one position. Looking at the shocked Elia, he stated that he would come back, noting that then she would have to give him the answer he wanted. After which, the lord turned around and left the ice cave. A light stream of wind arose in its depths, which scattered particles of snow. From severe shock, Elia fell to her knees. Her gaze was shrouded in anxiety and excitement. Looking at the snow-capped mountains, she couldn't believe that Ricky had died. Lowering her head, Charles tried to catch her breath. Turning to the attacking Azura, Riley's wondered if he would continue to use his 6 arms. Screaming, Charles asked Riley's to stop and come back. From what he heard, the demon tried to find out why so suddenly, noting that it was just starting to get more fun here. Looking at the protagonist standing next to her, Charles wondered if he was going to subjugate her, noting that she admitted this, adding that he had the right to say such things. Taken aback, she announced that this was her defeat, saying that now she would obey him. Charles said with a confident face that she would now obey. In the heat of battle, Azura and Riley's heard this and stopped. Frustrated, Riley said that she was very sorry to stop the fight, because she had just warmed up her body. The battlefield lit up purple and the woman disappeared from Azura's hands, telling him that they would meet again. Seeing this, Azura was very dissatisfied. Following Riley's, Azura disappeared, leaving Charles and Lucas alone. While on her knees, Charles informed the protagonist that she could not simply obey, adding that although she looked like that now, she was in fact the queen of vampires. Lucas, looking at Charles, asked her a rhetorical question. Is it true according to her words that she is going to conclude a contract on his blood, calling her a cunning granny? Smiling, the main character turned to Charles again, saying that if he did not have enough skill, she would want to make Lucas her blood relative and subjugate him to herself. Smiling maliciously, Charles asked if he was chickening out. With a calm expression on his face, the main character assured that he was in no way a coward and offered to try. At that same second, Charles bared her vampire fangs and jerked them into Lucas's neck. After taking the bite, Charles furiously declared that Lucas was finished. The main character did not react to Charles's statement. At that moment, the two of them are enveloped in darkness, and in pitch darkness, Lucas's true appearance appears. Looking around, the main character looked at Charles. She, in turn, looking at him and seeing his true face, said that this is what his true appearance means. Confused, Lucas asked her what this place was and whether she created it. Crossing her arms over her chest, Charles explained that this place was called Void Space and that in this place they were not affected by real-world time. With a smirk on her face, Charles continued, stating that she would be able to keep the protagonist here for several hundred years until he swore his allegiance to her. At this statement, Lucas covered his mouth with his hand and grinned. Scratching his face with one finger, the main character apologized to Charles and assured her that he did not mean to grin, adding that if you compare the space of emptiness with the space that he knows, then he feels comfortable here as if it were a paradise. Stretching his arms to the sides, Lucas said that his body and Charles herself are here, and also, according to him, all his sensations are just as active. Confused in her mind, Charles wondered what Lucas was even talking about, adding that she didn't think he was just bluffing. Looking at him, Charles again wondered if he really cared that he was here, adding that no matter how strong his spirit, she did not think that a person could spend even a year in such a place. Standing opposite the main character, Charles asked him who he was. Suddenly standing behind Charles and grabbing her head, Lucas declared that he would tell her who he really was. At that moment, Charles's pupils disappeared and the image of an eerie and gloomy place appeared in front of her. Then the main character appeared, to whom the hands of the dead were reaching out. Using Lucas' body, the gray hands of the dead began to tear his flesh. The main character did not react, while the hands continued their work. Then the hands reached Charles. She screamed heartrendingly in fear. Suddenly the situation changed. Lucas asked the lying and crying Charles if she was okay, adding that if we consider that it was only 1 year, it turns out that he just gave her just a little taste. Standing with his back to Charles, the main character continued to speak, explaining that having existed like this for about a century, he completely forgot to continue counting time, and that when he returned, 4,000 years had passed. Shocked by what she saw, Charles wondered if these were really memories of what a person could endure. Looking at the calm face of the main character, Charles noticed in her thoughts that this was completely impossible. Leaning her hand on the stone ground, Charles tried to turn to Lucas, but could not hold back her tears. While the main character looked at Charles with the same imperturbable gaze, she meanwhile addressed him by name. Having given free rein to her emotions, Charles wanted to ask a question. Without allowing Charles to finish, the protagonist put his hand on her head and asked if she would obey him. Bowing her head, Charles declared that she would follow any order from Lucas. Hearing Charles's statement, the protagonist smiled tenderly. While in the resulting crater, the main character gave his first order to Charles, saying that when the sun goes down, she would have to send Heinz Blake here, adding that she would never assign an escort to him, to which Charles dutifully obeyed. Looking at the main character, Charles asked him if he had returned to destroy the demigods. With her face still stained with tears, Charles looked at Lucas. As he left, the main character turned to Charles and confirmed her question. While the main character was leaving, Charles was still sitting looking in the direction of the departing Lucas. Biting her lips, Charles again could not hold back her tears. Against the backdrop of a slowly flowing stream, the sun slowly rose. The wind blew the hair of the main character, who stood on a cliff and looked somewhere into the distance. Then the wind picked up, now blowing not only Lucas' hair but also his white robe. Williams appeared behind the main character. Turning around, Lucas noticed a figure with fiery hair. Phoenix appeared before the main character. Looking at Phoenix with a calm gaze, Lucas informed her that he had been waiting for her. Heading towards Phoenix, the main character noticed that she had changed a lot during the time they had not seen each other, adding that he came to her because he wanted to ask something. Reminiscing about the past, Lucas continued saying that it surprised him and that he could not have imagined that their re-meeting would take place in such a place. Phoenix did not react to the main character's statements. Putting on a more serious face, Lucas asked Phoenix why she decided to become the Apostle of Agnes. Standing opposite each other, the main character continued to speak, asking Phoenix if this was her decision or if she had a reason why she could not say anything. With a river flowing through the rocks in the background, Lucas asked Phoenix to give an honest answer, adding that he was going to destroy all the demigods in this world. Phoenix still did not react, only the wind blew her bright strands of hair. With complete seriousness on his face, the protagonist stated that depending on Phoenix's response, he might have no choice but to kill her on the spot. Unimpressed by Lucas's speech, Phoenix asked him not to make her laugh, to which the main character was surprised. Looking at the perplexed Lucas, Phoenix asked the question mockingly and added that if he can, then let him try, calling the main character a non-entity. Phoenix's eyes flashed green and orange and she said with an evil smile that this was what she wanted to tell him, adding that since that day she had only been waiting for the moment when she could rip his throat to shreds. Phoenix bit her lip and looked at Lucas with anger. Suspecting something was wrong, the main character guessed that Torquita was talking to him, to which he, being in the body of Phoenix, said that Lucas quickly guessed. The main character noticed that this was strange, because he was sure that Phoenix was in this form, asking the question of whether he died, to which Torquita answered him that he could not die until he twisted Lucas' head. Feeling a headache, Torquita, in the body of the phoenix, grabbed his head. According to tear his hair, Torquita screamed in pain and apologized, saying that he understood everything. After recovering from the headache, Torquita angrily stated that it was infuriating him and that he could no longer get along with Phoenix. Putting one hand on his belt, the main character asked Torquita if he had an anxiety disorder, and he stated that Phoenix was to blame for all this. Against the background of Lucas' neutral face, Torquita revealed that when Phoenix absorbed his dead body, his consciousness also left with him, so they fought fiercely for control of the body. Frustrated, Torquita turned his back on Lucas and declared that he had lost. Furiously rolling on the ground, Torquita shouted that now because of this he lives in some corner and that if Phoenix wants, she can kick him out of here at any time, to which the main character, in response to Torquita's actions, asked him to stand up because the dust flies. Exhausted, Torquita wondered how this was even possible, because every day they thanked him for keeping them alive and were shaking with fear. Confused about the situation, Lucas asked Torquita why he was making a fuss now, against the backdrop of the protagonist's still neutral expression. Torquita stated that the reason for this is that he has now become a subordinate of a guy named Agni. The words of Torquita reached the thoughtful Lucas, and Phoenix told him not to meet with the main character directly, because they could be figured out, but to act in such a way that it would not cause harm to Lucas. Sitting on the ground, Torquita wanted to tell the reason why he became an apostle, but before he could begin, he was interrupted by the main character. Scratching the back of his head, Lucas noticed that Torquita insulted Phoenix all the time, stating that it was inconvenient for him to even listen, and then, asking him a rhetorical question about her not having a name. Looking at the ground, Torquita asked again, but then, distracted by something, asked the main character for a minute. Holding his head, Torquita began to talk to the phoenix in his head, wondering what kind of nonsense she was talking about, noticing that she was also embarrassed. Turning to Lucas, Torquita conveyed Phoenix's wish that he give her a name. Pointing a finger at himself, the main character asked if he really should do this, to which Torquita replied that this was Phoenix's wish. After some thought, the main character gave her the name Nyx with a smile. Hearing this, Torquita was not impressed by Lucas' imagination. Reasoning, Torquita asked that he chose the name Nyx because of Phoenix, adding sarcastically that the main character is very smart, to which Lucas replied that he thought the name was beautiful. Torquita then adds that Phoenix liked the new name and again urges her to stop blushing. Torquita continued his story and said that after his death, Nyx took possession of all these territories. Just the backdrop of the blue sky, Nyx stood looking into the distance. Suddenly, footsteps were heard behind the girl. Turning around, Nyx saw Agnia, which Torku had noted in his story. Remembering the image of Agnia, Torquita said that he was truly an incredible guy and that he had never been so scared in his life. With Nyx in the background, flames burning around her in anticipation of the battle, Torquita continued, saying that Nyx was going to fight him, that she put her life on the line even though she knew it. Torquita added that Nyx is dumber than dumb people and that she never plans or thinks about anything. Continuing his story, Torquita said that at that moment he came out and gave Nyx wise advice. With a smile on his face, Torquita stated that he suggested that she lay low and take care of her life, to which the protagonist asked him if he felt that his words and facial expressions did not fit each other. Rising from the ground, Torquita continued, saying that Agnia had never seen other strong forms of life, not counting the demigods, which is why Agnia became interested in Phoenix, stating that this was due to the fact that she had absorbed his heart. Looking into the distance, Torquita explained that in order to survive, they had to become apostles of Agnes, so they could not refuse. Lucas wanted to remind Torquita that he was Drake's king, but before he could finish his thought, Torquita interrupted him, blushing and shouting that the main character himself appeared, becoming Ricky's apostle. Throwing up his hands, Torquita said that Agnia is really strong, adding that alone he was able to cope with 3 apocalypses on his own. Following the edge of the cliff, Lucas wondered if Torquita had always been so talkative, to which he replied that he had not talked to anyone for a very long time, asking him a counter-question whether the main character understood how he felt. Looking after Lucas, Torquita asked him what happened to that demigod. Without turning to his interlocutor, the main character coldly declared that the demigod had died. Looking into the distance from the edge of the cliff, Lucas revealed that Ricky was going to suppress the demigods and that they acted together because they had the same goal. Following the protagonist, Torquita assured him that he and Nyx would join them, to which Lucas turned his head in his direction questioningly. Frowning, Torquita asked the main character why he was surprised, because they joined Agnia, not because they liked it. Torquita stated that they knew where Agnia was, which interested Lucas very much. Against the backdrop of the desert, Torquita said that Agnia is in the Silky Desert, adding that the exact location will only be known upon arrival there. Turning to Torquita, the protagonist praised him, saying that he was surprisingly useful, adding the question of whether this was thanks to Nyx. To such a statement, Torquita furiously replied that the truth would kill him. Turning around in the opposite direction, Torquita explained that they say that in order for Agnia to recover, he will need 1 year, adding that he needs to act before the deadline. Torquita reassured Lucas by saying that if they received any other information, they would tell him everything. The main character, with a calm expression on his face, thanked them. As Torquita left, he gave Lucas a warning to be careful. With a questioning expression on his face, the main character looked after the departing figure of the woman. Raising his hand, Torquita stated that Nyx asked to convey this, which Lucas was not surprised by. With a satisfied and joyful expression on his face, the main character looked forward. Against the backdrop of the majestic mountains, Lucas asked them to also be careful and not go beyond the mountain ranges, to which they replied that even without his words, they would not have done this. A dilapidated tower appeared around the ruins, towards which a figure in a black cloak was walking. As Heinz walked up the steps, he was surprised, but kept a neutral expression on his face. Noticing the main character, Heinz confirmed his guesses. Lucas, with a straight face, turned towards Heinz. Standing not far from the main character, Heinz said that it seemed that in the end Lucas had absorbed Luke's crystal. Adding that he had heard rumors that immediately after he began contacting Banyan from the Traman Circle, the main character began to hide his traces. Heinz then wondered why Lucas chose the path of the Sword Apostle. Without answering the question, the main character said that he had heard about the secret of the Blake family. The perplexed Heinz heard Lucas's words that they say that this is a place for experiments, where they become subordinates of Ruin, study divine powers and the compatibility of mana. At the words of the protagonist, Heinz frowned. Putting his hand on his belt, Lucas asked Heinz to answer honestly who he was closer to, the demigods or the circles. With a downcast look, Heinz stated that he had no feelings for anyone, adding that he was simply trying his best to stay alive. Rinang, the main character, noted that this was a good answer. Looking at the rising sun, Lucas asked Heinz to take him to the Blake estate. With a piercing gaze, Heinz wondered why he needed this, to which the protagonist replied that he needed to find something. Heinz asked Lucas what he wanted to find. In response, with a calm expression on his face, the main character replied that Heinz may not know this. Narrowing his eyes, Lucas continued. He stated that the Blake family could not escape destruction. Heinz was horrified by what he heard and asked why Lucas wanted to go there with him, because the main character's house is there too. In turn, the main character asked a counter-question. Wouldn't they consider it strange if he suddenly returned alone? Heinz's face showed a grimace of surprise as Lucas addressed him as Apostle Rayron. Not expecting this, Heinz was speechless, and the only thing he could do was wonder in his thoughts whether the main character was really his younger brother Frey. Putting his hand on his belt, Heinz stated that he understood Lucas's desire and that he would do as he wanted, adding that Launder Charles also ordered to actively help in all the desires of the protagonist. Returning his gaze to Lucas, Heinz said that Charles asked him not to ask anything. Looking at the neutral and calm protagonist, Heinz asked what happened there and how Launder Charles could recognize him so easily. Lucas scratched his chin and thought about it. Against the backdrop of a large estate, the main character wondered that maybe it was because he and Charles had the same blood type. As Lucas walked towards the estate, he thought in his head that Frey's feelings were boiling over. While the guards opened the gate, the main character continued to think that this was not melancholy, but fear. Walking through the gate, Lucas said in his thoughts that Frey had finally returned home to the place where he had given up on his own in his life. The guards saluted and greeted Heinz. Looking at the two guards, Heinz noted that they were working hard. Genuine surprise was reflected on the face of one of the guards. He turned to Heinz, asking who was walking next to him. With a calm expression on his face, Lucas asked the guards that during all this time they had even forgotten his face. The two guards were surprised again. With their eyes wide open, the two guards exclaimed that young Master Frey had returned. Having noticed something, Heinz suggested that it seemed that besides the family, there was someone else at home. One of the guards announced that a guest had arrived here. Turning around, Heinz heard that it was Her Highness the Third Princess. Walking through the courtyard of the estate, Heinz stated that for several years now, their family has often met with the Third Princess, adding that although the princess usually only talks to her mother. In his thoughts, the main character immediately wondered that the princess was talking to Leisha Blake. Turning to Heinz, the main character asked if the name of the third princess was Fiore, to which Heinz confirmed Lucas' question. Looking at the small crowd of people, Heinz said that they had all gathered. Looking at Fiore, Heinz announced that the third princess was beautiful and wise, so in fact she had influence due to the fact that the emperor loved her the most. Against the backdrop of the princess's beautiful face, Heinz added that she is 25 years old this year, adding that it is said that she is postponing the wedding in order to increase her political power. With a disappointed expression on his face, the main character said that it was a pity that she was 25. Heinz immediately called on Lucas to shut up, declaring that it was impossible to simply tell a girl about her age, which had long since crossed the boundaries of marriage. As Lucas approached the crowd, he said that if only Fiore were 10 years older, she would be his type, which surprised Heinz. Seeing Heinz, Mitchell greeted him. Approaching Fiore, Heinz knelt down and kissed her hand, saying that they had not seen each other for a long time, to which the princess agreed. Mitchell looked at Heinz and asked what was wrong, since he appeared so suddenly and didn't even contact them. Noticing Lucas, Mitchell narrowed his eyes angrily, asking why he came with Heinz. When Mitchell turned to the main character, his face did not express any emotion. Looking at Lucas, Isaka asked a rhetorical question. Answering the question, the main character said how much time had passed, father. Standing next to his wife, Isaka stated that they were standing in front of an important guest, so he suggested that they discuss all the details later. Looking out to Lucas, Fiore greeted him with the words that she was pleased to meet you. Noticing this, Mitchell turned to the princess, saying that she might not pay attention to this guy Frey. Hearing this, the father of the family was very surprised. Kneeling down, the main character kissed Fiore's hand. Kissing the hand, Lucas introduced himself as Frey, the third son of the Blake family, adding that he was honored to meet the princess called the Sapphire of the imperial family. Moving away from Fiore's hand, the protagonist said that he would be incredibly happy to accompany her personally, but his clothes are too dusty for this now, so he asked to forgive him. Fiore couldn't hide her surprise when she heard that Lucas didn't want to be just someone for her, so he asked to be allowed to leave this meeting first. The whole family watched this spectacle while the main character continued to speak. He said that he believed that the princess was very tired after the journey she had endured, to which Fiore answered him to do as he wished. Looking at this whole picture, Mitchell could not contain his anger and contempt for Lucas. Taking the example of the protagonist, Heinz also asked to forgive him. The two brothers went inside the estate. Looking into the distance at the departing men, Fiore turned to Isaka, saying that she did not know that he had a third son. In response to the princess's question, Isaka stated that even if he lacks a lot compared to his brothers. With her back to the duke, the princess informed him that she did not think so. Fiore's face showed interest. From one of the rooms of the estate, Heinz asked what Lucas was going to do now. In a room where chaos reigned, Heinz stood opposite the main character, and he, in turn, sat by the window. Looking out the window, Lucas replied to Heinz that since he had returned home for a long time, he should do what a third son should do. Heinz, hearing this, explained to the main character that there was no need to act, it was better for him to be himself. With a calm expression on his face, Heinz informed Lucas that as he himself knew, rumors about him had reached here to some extent. Then Heinz began to list these rumors, such as suppressing pirates, being friends with Pierre Juna and going to the magic tower. Heinz added that to forcefully pretend to be a past self, on the contrary, would look even more unnatural. Continuing to look out the window, Lucas said that he would take Heinz's words into account. Moonlight streamed through the windows of the estate while Lucas meditated. Hearing that someone entered, the main character opened his eyes. Looking towards the door, Lucas saw one of the butlers. With a straight face, the butler stated that the head of the house was calling the main character. Then, the butler just said, "Have dinner." Turning an angry, sidelong glance at Lucas, the butler furiously said in his thoughts that the outcast had suddenly returned and forced everyone to work even harder. Walking down the corridor, the butler heard the main character call out to him rudely. The butler, full of rage, repeated what the main character said. When the butler turned around, he exclaimed in surprise when he saw Lucas right in front of him. With a calm expression on his face, the protagonist reminded the butler not to forget to knock. When leaving, Lucas warned that he would endure it once, but not again. The horrified butler could not believe that he was afraid of this outcast, wondering if it was indeed Frey. A beautiful feast appeared before our eyes. The whole family had dinner. Having finished his portion, the main character wiped his mouth with a napkin when the words reached him that his father had sent his man to the magic tower a long time ago. Then they turned to Lucas with the question that he had only appeared now. Looking at the embittered Mitchell, the main character remembered this event in his thoughts, noting that all this time he had so much to do that he completely forgot about it. Mitchell angrily turned to Lucas, saying that he didn't seem to know what it meant to ignore his father's challenge, to which Isaka asked Mitchell to stop. With a confident expression on his face, Isaka asked the main character where he had been all this time, adding that it seems that after that incident, he left the tower. Pouring himself a cup of tea, Lucas replied that he had returned just after walking around the world. Mitchell only laughed sarcastically, ridiculing the protagonist's statement about traveling the whole world, adding that, as rumors said, during this time he became even more of a braggart. Against the backdrop of his mother calmly drinking tea, Mitchell continued, saying that in the end the stupid stories following Lucas could not be true to him. Looking at all this, the father looked displeased when Mitchell suggested that the main character was kicked out of the academy, so maybe they were thrown out of the magic tower too. Hines, as well as the rest of the family, listened calmly, while Mitchell was still saying that as a result, Lucas did nothing but run away, asking a question at the end. With a straight face, the main character took a sip of tea and then put the cup on the saucer. In his thoughts, Lucas noticed that not even a quarter of a day has passed since he returned, but there really is nothing good in this family, adding that because of this family attitude, even the butler looks at him like an insect. With this realization he realized how much Frey had suffered. With a cold expression on his face, the main character stated that he did not run away, to which Mitchell only laughed incredulously. Pointing his finger at Lucas, Mitchell suggested that he try to make up a story about what he got while he was going around the world. The father and mother of the family heard this and fixed their gaze on them. Smiling maliciously, the main character was glad how well everything had turned out, because just in order to act with comfort, he needed a reputation in this place. Putting his hand to his temple, Lucas said that he thought that he had at least become stronger than Michelle. When Mitchell heard his older brother's smug words about superiority in strength, his face changed sharply, being in absolute bewilderment. In the head of the family, stocky Asaka stared intently at the youngest of his sons, while Leshia giggled into her hand, causing the wrinkles to appear more clearly on her face. Suddenly, Mitchell, sitting on the opposite side of the table from the Freys, burst into loud laughter, noting that the third son of the Blake family had received at least some benefit from the trip, because before the young man could not even look him in the eyes, but now he had become incredibly brave. To the wild laughter of his brother, praising the main character, Hines, with a concentrated look, pulled the mug to his mouth to drink the contents. Mitchell, on whose face very noticeable tear grooves are visible, looked piercingly at Frey with mint-colored eyes, twisting his mouth in a malicious smile and caustically offending him with his words. The white-haired young man, in turn, only raised his hand and calmly replied that he would save his words, because for the first time in a long time he was having a meal with his family. Then Mitchell cast a sidelong glance at his father, addressing him in a drawn-out manner. Asaka looked at his eldest son and dispassionately said that this was a matter between two brothers, advising him to do as he himself saw fit. Leaning his hand on the edge of the table, Mitchell began to rise, after which he concluded that there was nothing wrong with sports after eating. Heat, putting his hand on his hip, looked at Frey and with a sly smile called him behind him. Mitchell turned towards the exit, leaving the family at the dining table behind. After him everyone rose from their seats except Heinz, who was carefully pouring himself some tea. Leaving the dining room, Lecia turned around and cast a curious glance at her son sitting at the table. He stopped and turned to Heinz, asking why he decided not to go with his family, to which the guy calmly said that he was not interested. Examining the drink in the white mug with a gold rim, Heinz reflected that Frey was most likely confident that his future would be hindered by the family's prejudices directed at him, concluding that although Mitchell was strong, he was still not an apostle. While all four, led by Michelle, walked along the garden tiles in the twilight, Heinz understood that everything was obvious and without a fight and, not wanting to watch his older brother's defeat, remained at the table. Sipping tea from a mug, the middle son of the family, Blake, worriedly wondered whether Frey would kill Mitchell during the battle. Meanwhile, the older and younger brother chose the estate's courtyard as a place for battle, standing opposite each other. Carefully examining Frey, Mitchell noticed that the young man, who had previously fallen even from a light wind, had now challenged him to a fight and was now standing with a calm expression on his face. He looked into Frey's imperturbable eyes, mentally wondering whether his younger brother was hiding his feelings behind a stone mask or had truly gone crazy. The mother and father were positioned a little further away from their sons and Mitchell turned to Frey, letting him be the first to use magic, which made the young man at a loss. Throwing a condescending, arrogant look at his younger brother, Mitchell said that this would not be a real fight, but only an educational measure. Frey looked down, puzzled, wondering what to do. Looking at his parents, the young man concluded that he should not show strength above the required level because he was next to the apostle Riran. Frey raised his hand a little, and a blue stream of mana began to appear from his palm as he activated a magic missile. With one hand on his hip and the other scratching his head, Mitchell said in disappointment that, based on the confidence of his younger brother, he expected at least a third star from him. When the older guy opened his eyes, frowning, they were shining from the blue glow of a magical missile aimed at him, which was approaching at full speed. Mitchell, gritting his teeth, barely had time to dodge the attack when the energy ball flew sharply past, crashing into the tile, from which fragments flew. The eldest son of the Blake family hurried to turn around, assessing the damage caused by his brother's attack. He looked with great concern at the place where the rocket landed and was greatly amazed by its incredible speed and destructive power. Suddenly there was a sharp clatter of feet and dark boots, loudly stepping on the tiles. Mitchell was caught off guard by Frey, who was quickly rushing straight towards him and froze with his arms and legs outstretched. While Lecia watched the battle with her mouth open, the face of her husband Azex showed almost no emotion, the man only looked concentrated. The enraged Mitchell, meanwhile, formed an energy flow in the palm of his outstretched hand, creating an ice arrow. Frey, who approached him, furiously raised his fist to strike, punching air masses along the way. When Mitchell shot an arrow at his brother, with one wave of his hand he broke it into small ice fragments flying in different directions. The older brother watched the younger brother in horror, not believing that he managed to break his ice arrow with his bare hands. While Mitchell was distracted by thoughts, Frey quickly got as close as possible and sharply launched a kick, which the guy barely managed to dodge. While the main character was looking at his older brother, a strong blue glow emanated from his eyes, which, with rapid movements, stretched as a stripe from the iris. Mitchell let out a rather loud scream as his younger brother's hand was on his chest and he began to strike using mana. Frey, surrounded by fragments of an ice arrow, launched a powerful attack and lifted his brother into the air. The Duke, taken aback, watched his youngest son with wide eyes, noting that he had managed to master the techniques of warrior magicians. Mitchell, hanging in the air, grabbed Frey's wrist and loudly asked indignantly how he even dared to take his older brother by the throat. After these words, a very angry Mitchell activated the soul flame with a scream, after which he became covered in fire. The entire space was now engulfed in strong flames, and the elder brother asked Frey not to be offended, because the loss of just one arm was a small cost for rebelling against the elder brother. Without removing his hand from Mitchell, the main character just grinned, which made the guy perplexed. Frey, calling his older brother a moron, said with a sarcastic look that he was not at all hot. After these words, the main character hit Michelle hard in the face with his fist, crushing her cheeks and knocking out a couple of teeth. The attacked guy flew up and turned over in the air from the power of the blow inflicted by the furious Frey. After that, Mitchell began to fall to the ground, raising dust with his landing. The defeated guy in a turquoise robe was now facing the tiles among the rubble, and Frey calmly looked at him while the air currents ruffled his hair, gathered in a ponytail. Mitchell lay on the tile, shaking in pain and making loud, inarticulate sounds. He opened his mouth wide, rolling his eyes from the pain piercing his body. The main character in the body looked at Michelle with a gloomy look, concluding, mentally asking how Frey was feeling, and concluding that no one would dare treat him badly again. A worried servant ran towards Michelle, who was imprinted into the tile, shouting along the way that the young master needed to be cured as soon as possible, and Frey, standing with his back to his parents, turned slightly towards them. When his father noted that he had studied warrior mage techniques to replenish the missing mana, Isaka looked at his youngest son with pride, reporting that this fight was impressive. Having fallen silent, the stocky man with a beard continued to cast a serious glance at his child standing opposite. Frey stated that he thought it would be difficult to level up with magic alone, to which Isaka pointed out that martial arts were another way to use mana. Amazed by what he saw, the man noted with surprise that Frey had grown. Leshia, standing to the side, looked at her youngest son with reverence, smilingly announcing that she was proud of him. The main character looked at the satisfied faces of the man and woman, shocked by how easily they spoke about pride to a child whom they themselves kicked out. Thinking about how disgusting the Blake family was, Frey acted completely the opposite, thanking his mother with a smile. In the darkness of the night one could still discern the bright buds of red roses. Leshia and Frey were now sitting in a white gazebo at a round table, and the woman turned to her son, asking if he remembered Princess Fjord, whom he had met that morning. While the woman was serenely pouring herself tea, Frey answered in the affirmative, after which his mother said that the girl came for training. Summarizing the above, Leshia concluded that the third princess and favorite of the emperor would be associated with the Blake family. Holding the handle of a mug of hot tea, the lady noted that both Michelle and Heinz are now the right age for marriage. Watching Leshia, Riren's apostle, sip tea, Frey concluded that she had decided to contact the imperial palace and tried to understand her real plan. Meanwhile, the woman pulled the guy out of his deep thoughts, puzzling him with the question, "What about him?" From the gazebo came the voice of Lydius, praising the no longer so young but still beautiful Princess Fjord, who is quite suitable as a bride. Leshia admitted with a kind smile that the girl was so great that the lady was even sorry to give her to her youngest son, even though he was also her child. From the rose bushes there was a good view of the gazebo, where Leshia leaned towards, who awkwardly said that this was very unexpected, and the mother responded by saying that the princess considered the young man a good person when they met. The main character watched with a puzzled look as the lady persistently tried to persuade him to agree to the wedding, and thereby gain recognition as a worthy member of the Blake family. Frey, without looking away from his glassy gaze, thought with displeasure about why there was recognition and non-recognition within the family. While Leshia looked at her son with hope, he asked how his life would change from the recognition of his family. After the question asked by her son, the lady smiled softly, which emphasized the wrinkles on her face. While the tea was cooling on the table, Leshia hastened to answer, claiming that a lot would change. The woman, as an example, said that then the secrets of the Blake family would be shared with Frey. Taking a mug of tea from a saucer in his hands, the main character reflected on what he had heard, concluding that the woman reported on the Blake family's experiments in combining mana and skills. Leshia said that she was giving her son 3 days to put his thoughts in order and accept the situation. After these words, the woman stood up and began to move away towards the estate, while Frey, raising tea to his mouth, followed her with his eyes. He looked at the leaving woman with a gloomy look. The servant, who had previously been rude towards the younger Blake, now out of fear of the young man, greeted Frey cordially. While the main character walked along the corridor of the estate, the valet with a red bob followed him, sucking up the fact that in the absence of the young man he had properly cleaned and tidied up his room. Without turning to look at the man, Frey noted with displeasure that the family and the butler showed themselves weak only in front of the strong, and the servant behind asked if there was anything else that was causing him inconvenience. Frey just waved his hand at the man, demanding that he leave, because he was already getting ready to sleep. The butler obligingly listened to all the young man's demands that no one be allowed near him during sleep, rubbing his hands with his eyes closed. It was night over the luxurious castle of the Blake Duchy, and darkness enveloped the entire sky. A black cat was sitting on a rumpled bed, actively licking its paw. Frey leaned half-sitting on a pillow at the head of the bed, scratching the neck of Darkman, who had visited him. While the cat was licking the guy's finger, he asked to notify her if someone hostile approached him. After this, Frey, stretched out on the bed, left his physical shell in his astral body using the ghost technique. Having ephemerally risen into the air, the protagonist with a gloomy expression concluded that he must be careful, because despite the fact that other life forms will not be able to sense him, Ririn may be here. Seeing the six-eared cat Darkman on the bed to look after his physical body, Frey left the bedroom, flying straight through the wall. He hovered like a ghost from the ceiling, flying past guards dressed in armor. Landing right next to one of them, the young man dived into the floor. Now he was rushing through the wooden ventilation shafts. He understood where he needed to go, hearing a voice perplexed by the decision about the princess' engagement to Frey. The main character dived down, appearing from the ceiling in an ephemeral body. He froze upside down in the air, watching a second lead as sitting in front of each other at the table in the candlelight. Frey hovered in the secret room where the lady was now telling her husband that they had no other choice. Closing her eyes, Lesia calmly concluded that they could not send Michelle to the princess with a completely broken nose. Sokka then tried to argue with his wife, considering Fjord's entry into their territory dangerous, and not understanding why the lady was so obsessed with her. Frey sank lower when Lesia said that they needed this girl, the only one capable of providing what they needed. The main character listened to Asaka asking his wife again with incomprehension, and she responded by saying that Mrs. Ririn demands more than this. Hearing this, the head of the Blake family closed his eyes in understanding. Frey opened his mouth in surprise when he heard that we were talking about aluminum. Then Lesia put her finger to her lips, asking her husband not to just talk about him, because Ririn asked to keep everything an absolute secret. Asaka admitted that he couldn't understand one thing. Lesia stood up menacingly when she heard her husband ask why they were so dependent on Princess Fjord if it was an alloy created by Lady Ririn. The next moment she was sitting in the chair again, hugging herself with her arms and nodding her head. Asaka looked at his wife with a serious look when she only said Harkon. Putting her hand on her cheek, Lesia explained that Princess Fjord is the only one who can obtain large quantities of the main ingredient for the fusion, Harkon. The woman said that although she did not yet know why they needed the material in such quantities, in the future when ordering large volumes there was a possibility of being caught, when Frey finally realized what it was. Holding his chin, Asaka with a thoughtful look came to the conclusion that if he made the princess a person of the Blake family, there would be no problem. Looking at his parents, Frey gloomily concluded that the weakness of the Blake family was Princess Fjord. When Lesia began to rise from the table, Asaka hurried to stop her, wanting to ask one more question. He asked his wife where Mrs. Ririn herself was currently located. Frey hovered in front of the woman, waiting for an answer. Lesia, breaking into a smile, replied that this should not worry a sec. After that, the lady headed towards the exit and the perplexed head of the Blake family, together with the ephemeral Frey, followed her with their gaze. Lowering his eyes to the floor, Asaka pursed his lips and began to shake with irritation. Darkman, who remained in Frey's bedroom, sat on the floor and looked around intently. She began to turn her head sharply with a worried look in her large yellow eyes. Darkman looked at Frey, who had returned to his body and made a loud sound. After that, the cat jumped on the young man's bed, caressing him. Darkman climbed into Frey's arms and he, thanking her for the protection, began to stroke her fur. Being in the same position, the main character was thinking about the situation in which he found himself. Lesia was now producing a large amount of aluminium on Ririn's orders, and the woman, judging by Isaac's reaction, is the head of the Blake clan. And for the sake of getting what he needs from Harkon, she wants Princess Fjord to enter their family, so the red-haired girl is the key to preventing aluminium from being made. Opening the window, Frey wondered how much the princess herself was guessing. The guy decided to prepare a place where he and the girl could meet alone, concluding that it would not be easy at all. It was already daylight on the street when the young man was considering how best to approach Fjord. Now the princess, closing her eyes, said with a smile that she was glad to meet Frey again. He looked at the girl in bewilderment, not at all expecting such a turn. Standing next to his mother, Frey concluded that the chance came to him when the princess asked the young man to show her the estate. Pleased, Leisha began to whisper to her son that she was right when she said in the past that the girl was also interested in him. Fjord looked at the Blakes with an awkward look, asking with annoyance whether she had arrived too suddenly. Frey smiled at her, closing his eyes, and convinced her otherwise, declaring that he was worried about their chaotic meeting yesterday. Frey and Fjord began to move deeper into the corridor, leaving behind a satisfied Leisha, who followed the couple with her gaze. The woman continued to intently watch the young people for some time, expressing hope with her appearance. Fjord turned to Frey, smilingly saying that she had heard about a young man who was Pierre's friend, noting that they often played together as children. Suddenly the girl stumbled out of the blue. She began to fall, apologizing for her misstep while Frey looked at her in bewilderment. The young man did not let the princess fall, catching her in time. The main character held Frey, putting his hand on her waist and taking the girl by the wrist, and with a smile asked if she was okay, and she thanked him. Frey, with a bead of sweat appearing, thought with displeasure that he was with this woman, whose acting was simply terrible. Suddenly the young man opened his eyes in severe shock. The girl made a romantic gesture, intertwining her pink fingers with Frey's hand. Suddenly flushed with embarrassment, Fjord pulled back, citing an important meeting with an awkward laugh. She looked at Frey with a loving gaze, joyfully announcing that they would see each other again. Having said this, the girl began to move away, leaving the discouraged protagonist alone. Shocked by this behavior, Frey watched the princess go. Looking at the hand, the man concluded that Princess Fjord was not someone to be taken lightly. With all her previous actions, the girl was able to quietly leave a note in Frey's palm, announcing a secret meeting at night near the hotel. Anticipating the upcoming meeting, Fjord preened herself in front of the mirror. The girl in black in her chambers, watching the princess fix her makeup so late at night, concluded that this was an incredible man, and Fjord suggested that she do the same sometimes. Looking back at the guard in a ninja costume with a weapon on her belt and a mask, the red-haired lady said with a smile that cold winter tones would suit her, but she didn't think that leaving traces for the guards would be a good idea. Choking. Fjord dreamily noted that sometimes beauty becomes a weapon, and the right facial expression suppresses the enemy better than words. When there was a knock on the door, Veronica and the princess turned sharply towards the sound. Fjord allowed entry and the door began to open. The girl looked at Kane standing in front of her, who made a pitiful face. The princess concluded that Frey had arrived quite early. Looking at the change, but always in the passive face of the young man, she said that it was not so bad. Leaning on the dressing table, Fjord looked at her hand and at the same time reported that she had heard a lot about the fictitious name of the main character. Standing opposite Frey, the princess shared rumors that he was the new launderer of the Traman Circle. Changing the shell with the help of mana to the usual Frey, the young man was surprised that the girl was interested in the Traman Circle. Sitting down on the table, Fjord lowered her head and admitted that her mentor was interested, thanks to whom she also learned that the guy had revived the almost destroyed circle. After these words, the girl looked with admiration at Frey, who later left the organization and began to wander alone. The girl assumed that the young man opposite with a calm face was planning something very important. He smiled good-naturedly, telling her in a drawn-out manner that she was mistaken. In his memories, Frey was transported to the site of the Battle of the Traman Circle, where the enemy began to retreat. The head of the organization, Banyan, then furiously announced that all those who had invaded the territory were suppressed, inviting them to surrender and capitulate. Then the enemies laughed at the girl's desire to join forces. Opponents angrily reported that the whole world was subject to natural selection, surrounding the members of the circle. One of the criminals in black quickly rushed down from his place. Holding out a knife, the man with his face hidden by a mask decided to fly straight at Banyan and deal with her. Suddenly, a strong bolt of lightning struck the man in the air, causing him to scream loudly. The organization turned around, noticing that Isabella had carried out the attack. She, surrounded by lightning, said that Traman's circle is different. Isabella, pointing to a squad of opponents, threateningly offered a choice: stopped being people or joining carrying out the will of the organization. Plunging into memories, Frey with a smile informed the princess that his strong friend was now replacing him in the position of Launder, meaning Isabella, after which he concluded that having a comrade is more reliable than it seems. He curiously asked whether Fjord was of the same opinion, mentioning not only a comrade, but also a servant among possible confidants. The girl looked at Frey in bewilderment, not understanding what he wanted to say, and the young man said that he was a little sorry. The main character said that he was hoping for a secret meeting with the princess, and she replied that this is what it is. The Frey shook his head, looking around with an impassive look. He, along with the princess, now looked at the ceiling, declaring that the third person present then was an intruder. The ceiling was empty. Suddenly, the hanging figure of the guard Veronica in black appeared on it, and 'tis displeasantly. She immediately rushed with a weapon at Frey, who was able to easily detect her. Fjord screamed furiously, trying to stop the guard. At this time, the main character, putting up an energy barrier with one hand, stopped Veronica with the other. Trying to justify herself to Frey, the princess said in confusion that the girl in black was her guard. Closing his eyes, Frey answered with a carefree smile that he should have been more precise. Veronica looked with concern at the young man's outstretched hand when he declared that one more moment and her face would have been torn to pieces. After this statement, the main character knocked the dagger out of the guard's hand. The girl's hands were shaking while Tat looked at Frey with tension, causing a vein to bulge on her forehead, and he concluded that the princess had a real assassin on her guard. Fjord looked at Frey with concern and confusion when he called her insightful, not believing that he was a 20-year-old guy. Sitting on the bed, the young man decided to get to the point, since the meeting turned out to be not a sweet secret meeting. Frey's face changed, looking seriously at Thor and asking how much she knew about Levi's plans. The blue-eyed princess silently concluded that the guy had already seen through everything when he began to insist that he was not a supporter of the Blake family. Pushing her hair behind her ear, Fjord said in confusion that she knew about the intentions to join her family and isolate her from the palace and, after thinking, decided to add something else. While Veronica squatted next to the fallen dagger, holding her brush wordly, Fjord added that Leisha desperately wanted to get some resources from her. Looking piercingly at his interlocutor, Frey clarified why she decided so. While the young man continued to sit on the edge of the bed, looking sideways at Fjord, she shared that over the past few years, the volume of orders from the Blake family has tripled, although they are unsuccessfully trying to justify themselves in the eyes of Her Highness. The family skillfully increased the amount of goods, among which were troll blood, 10-year-old mountain ginseng, Harkent, emeralds, as well as the bloody hands of beauties. Lowering her head, Fjord admitted with a slight blush that she still couldn't figure out the Blake family's purpose. Frey, listening to her with a slight smile, closed his eyes. The princess widened her eyes in surprise when the young man noted that she was as perceptive as they said she was. Fjord leaned on the openwork dressing table, looking at her interlocutor when he announced that among the listed goods there was what Leisha needed. The girl thought about it, noticing again that it didn't seem at all like the guy was younger than her, comparing his calmness with the trait inherent in a sage. In his behavior, the main character betrayed the great hero Lucas, which made the princess feel like she was having a dialogue with her mentor. Frey asked the question curiously, deciding to find out what kind of item Leisha needed. Frey turned to the princess seriously. Looking at the girl with her legs dangling over the dressing table, he asked if she was going to remain neutral. Puzzled, Frey, in turn, asked not to answer the question with a question. Her blue eyes widened in shock after Frey announced that the conquest of the continent by demigods was coming. The young man outlined the time during which this will happen, saying that it will take at least a year, and if it drags on, then about 2 years. The princess looked at the protagonist with concern when he noted that if everything was left as it was, during this time the girl could lose her life. Hearing the guy's words and mistaking them for a threat to Her Highness, the enraged Veronica immediately rushed at him with loud, dissatisfied screams. Raising his index finger, Frey calmly pierced the assassin's body with his technique to stop her. He looked dispassionately at the guard with slightly glowing blue eyes. The immobilized Veronica was shaking from the lightning bolts all over her body and, frowning with displeasure, tried to curse. Fjord, meanwhile, looked worriedly at her guard, who was attacked due to her temper. After this, the princess humbly closed her eyes. Lowering her head, Fjord asked the man how he could prove his words about the attack of demigods who had been living quietly for 4,000 years, and Frey said from the bed that now what had been bothering them for so long had disappeared. The princess was silent expectantly, but Veronica cast a menacing look at the main character and he said that Lecia wanted Harkon, which his interlocutor could get. Hearing these names, Fjord shrewdly stated that she thought so. Sitting with a serious expression on his face, Frey stated that this material would speed up the plans of the demigods. Flushed, the princess lowered her gaze to the floor and assumed that if she did not side with the demigods, they would intimidate her into getting Harkon. Rising from the dressing table, Fjord declared that she understood everything. She stood directly opposite Frey and asked with a perplexed look whether he recommended that she join the circle. The girl opened her mouth in shock when he said with a grin that this would not protect her. Frey waited silently as Fjord asked what he was offering. The young man got out of bed and approached the princess. He asked the girl to always be by his side to become her shield. Fjord looked at Frey with loving eyes. Her face began to turn red. In Fjord's mind, roses formed around Frey and Frey, surrounding them, the atmosphere filled with love. Veronica, standing to the side, hunched over a little, her eyes narrowed as she tried to call out to her princess. Fjord, looking at Frey with her blue eyes, suddenly realized something. Fjord turned away from Frey and raised her hand. Trying to come to her senses with waves of her palm, she simultaneously said that no matter how terrible this situation was, he didn't have to worry, because she wasn't stupid. Fjord looked to the side trying to calm herself. Traces of embarrassment could still be seen on her face. She was embarrassed by Frey, who suddenly said that he would become her shield. She wondered how he was not ashamed to say such things so easily. Fjord calmed down and turned her head, again fixing her gaze on Frey. She said that she was not afraid of death, which is why she walked along such a dangerous path. Frey looked at Frey, asking her if it was because she had someone to rely on. Maybe that's where her confidence came from. Frey, standing opposite Frey, made her exclaim after he suggested that her guardian was the owner of the 11th magic tower. Frey calmed down surprisingly quickly and, looking at Frey with a calm gaze, expressed her admiration for his knowledge. Fjord, bowing her head a little, walked past Frey. Frey, looking after her, said that he would really like to meet the owner of the tower and see what kind of person he is. Fjord approached Veronica and grabbed her hand, trying to help her get to her feet. Fjord asked about her well-being. Veronica answered her by saying that she really wanted to lose her sight now and not see what was happening. Fjord, looking at Veronica, decided to continue the conversation with Frey. She told him about her complete ignorance of the location and possible appearance of the master of the 11th magic tower. Frey narrowed his eyes and asked her if they had kept in touch. Fjord stuck her hand into her sleeve trying to get something. Fjord was holding a blue sphere in her hand, which was the only way to contact the master, but even so it can only be used by the master. Fjord spoke about all the nuances and capabilities of this ball. Suddenly, the ball began to glow brightly, collecting mana. It flew out of Fjord's hand, and streams of wind began to swirl around it. Fjord, with her arms outstretched and her mouth open in shock, looked at the ball that was emitting mana, streams of which rushed in all directions. Soon, from the mana that came out of the ball in front of Frey, a holographic figure of a man in a cloak was formed, who greeted Frey. Frey's gaze became serious when he realized that he could not see his interlocutor's face. While the man's figure did not move, but notified Frey about the conversation he had heard with Fjord, Frey pondered the reason that he could not see the face of the interlocutor. It was not because of the cape. He used a magical object that hid his appearance. This probably spoke of his reluctance to reveal himself. Frey stood with an emotionless face as he listened as Master Fjord agreed with his assumption about the demigods who were going to take over the mainland within the next 2 years. Frey looked at Master Fjord. He was a little surprised, because judging by his words, he also has some guesses. Fjord raised her hand and exclaimed, trying to warn Frey. In her opinion, her master was at such a high level that she could not even match the tips of his toes, so she asked Frey to be more polite. Frey stood in front of the holographic figure of the man, asking for forgiveness. He said that he did not see the face to whom he should have shown respect, so he could not do it. The man interrupted the words of Fjord standing behind him. Fjord bowed her head looking at her master and asked her not to worry, because Frey was saying the right things. Frey stood calmly, listening to the master say that he could not be assessed only by what the eyes saw. The master of the 11th tower stood motionless. He spoke about Ruinoble, in which a detachment of a black dragon was destroyed, and one day, he had suspicions that this was the act of the demigods. Frey, looking at the master, decided to answer and told about Nostok's action. The master, whose body never stopped lighting up, said how he assumed that someone from the apocalypse would be guilty, but even so the chance was small. Frey looked at the sphere emitting blue mana, suggesting that the Tower Master was well aware of the inner workings of the circles, because with the help of this beat it was possible to eavesdrop even on them. The Tower Master, from whose body pixels were constantly separating, laughed, asking about Frey's possible assumptions. Frey's lips curled into a faint smile as he named the Tower's Master, former Circle Master Straw Knuckles. Frey raised his hand, pointing his finger at the figure of the man. He spoke about the ball and the magical weapon placed in the man's body, which were a technique that was developed in Straw Knuckles about 50 years ago. Just at that time there was a change in their master, somewhat of his level I would not occupy other, more insignificant places. The male figure standing opposite Frey was surprised at how much he had determined at a glance. He confirmed that 50 years ago he was the master of Straw Knuckles. Frey approached the master a little and asked him about the reason for his leaving the circle. Frey stared at the man as he asked him if he knew a man named Osel Argento. Frey's gaze became distracted. He began to remember where he had heard this name. Frey remembered his first meeting with Banyan. Then Banyan, putting on a red cape, talked about the previous master of the Traman Circle. His name was Osel Argento, who was her own father. While the pixels were being separated from his body, the master of the 11th tower told Frey that Osel was the father of the true master of the Traman Circle, Banyan, and his old friend. The tower master remembered 3 figures of people who were masters of their circles. They stood over the bloody corpse of the former circle master Traman. His death was a strong incident that truly led the circles to decay. The 3 strongest circles decided to strike on the sly. Under the pretext of destroying apocalypses, they got rid of the master who had become unusually strong in the Traman Circle in order to reduce their strength. The man returned from his memories. He still stood, motionless, regretting that in the end he had failed to prevent the death of his friend. Fjord looked at the figure of her master, who began to talk about the Circle's promise to save this world. Humanity from the demigods, contempt was clearly felt in his voice. Fjord saw her master, standing in front of her, bow his head. Frey stood listening to the Tower Master talk about his eyes. Looking into them he remembered his friend Osel. Fjord stood behind the Tower Master. She suddenly exclaimed when she heard the Master's proposal. She suggested that Frey take the Traman Circle and join them. Frey was a little surprised by his proposal. His lips parted as he asked who he met by speaking to us. Frey looked at the projection of the man as he began to tell how, after leaving the circle for 50 years, he gathered people who had completely inherited the will of past heroes and formed an alliance with them, and unlike the rotten circles now, this is a strong alliance, focusing only for the sincere purpose of destroying the demigod. Fjord's mouth gaped in surprise. It was the first time she had seen the master personally offer to enter into an alliance. But to the surprise of the teacher and student, Frey, who stood opposite them, thanked them for the opportunity, and refused it. Frey, with a grin on his face, explained to them that he joined the circle because he wanted to transform the rotten organization, starting from its very bottom. The projection of the Tower Mater, continuing to emit pixels from its body, asked if Frey thought this was possible. Frey's lips parted and his answer came. She said that this question did not require a determination of the possibility or impossibility of its implementation. Fjord again could not help but open her mouth and widen her eyes in surprise as she listened to Frey say that the sincere purpose that her master spoke about was also in other circles at the very beginning. During the time when people gather and form organizations, this sincerity stagnates and rots. Frey stood motionless. He looked at the projection of his interlocutor and continued speaking. He talked about external organizations that appear at the moment of rotting of the old ones. The projection of the Tower Master decided to convince Frey by saying that he could be completely calm, because they would not rot or stagnate, but Frey interrupted him and said that such is the human essence and this is impossible. Frey looked at the projection, advising them not to deny this entity, because this could not be done, so it was necessary to consider the possibilities of removing it. Only then would they have the opportunity to escape from the hands of the demigods. The projection of a man whose face was covered by a cloak laughed when he heard Frey's words. The projection of the Tower Master, standing opposite Frey, was once again convinced that Frey was indeed a copy of Ossel. Frey smiled, and his gaze became softer when he heard the wishes of the Tower Master, who wished that the last moments of his and Ossel's lives would be different. Fjord shuddered when her master ordered her not to spare Frey's help. The projection of the Tower Master began to dissipate, and finally he expressed his gratitude for meeting him. He was overwhelmed with emotions from the feeling that he had met his old friend again. Frey looked at the dispersing projection of the man and asked his name. When the projection almost disappeared, she managed to say her name, and also said that his offer today would forever remain relevant. If he needed strength, they would gladly become his blade. Kyra Weissman's projection completely disappeared, leaving behind only a blue sphere floating in the air. Frey went into shock, his mouth falling open as he realized this man was a descendant of Shu. Fjord took the sphere in her hands. She and Frey stood looking at each other without saying a word. This moved to the luxurious mansion of the Blake family. Almost the entire Blake family, besides the eldest son, was sitting at the table having lunch. Frey's father, Isaka, brought a piece of cut steak to his mouth. The whole family, using cutlery, had a meal using all the rules of etiquette. Lesia looked at Frey when he suddenly said his consent to her proposal. After that, Frey didn't say a word and brought a piece of steak with his fork and took a bite of it. Soon there was a small piece of steak left on Frey's plate. Frey put his hands on his legs and said that he would marry Princess Fjord. Lesia, hearing his words, looked at him in surprise. Lesia sighed when she heard Frey's words. She looked at Frey with satisfied eyes. While Lesia closed her eyes smiling, Isaka looked at her with some seriousness. Frey's gaze became neutral, his face saddened. Frey remembered how yesterday after Kyra left, Frey came closer to Fjord and Veronica, asking her for 3 favors. Fjord looked at Frey accepting his request and asked him to continue. Frey looked at Frey, his request to postpone the engagement confused her. Veronica, realizing something, coughed and stroked her chin with her hand, her eyes narrowed in realization of one thing. Frey looked back at her cough, her face turned red from embarrassment at this moment. Frey noticed Veronica's actions but said nothing. Frey warned Frey not to appear too indifferent towards him. Frey waved her hand at her face, trying to calm herself down with the cool air hitting her face, while she assured Frey of her acting skills, to which Veronica, standing behind Veronica, disagreed with her in her thoughts. When Fjord calmed down, Frey, who was standing opposite her, asked her to stop selling the Harkin for a while. Fjord thought about it. She understood that if they wanted to do this without the Duke's wife guessing anything, they would need a good reason. Fjord extended her hand, telling Frey not to worry and leave this matter to her. Because this area was also part of her specialization, she asked about Frey's 3rd request. Fjord looked at Frey a little thoughtfully after his 3rd request. Frey's gaze was serious, the smile that was on his face a few minutes ago was missing. If you look at the Blake family's mansion, you could see that it occupied half the entire area of the city. Fjord on the table on a hill looking into the distance, her hair fluttering from the gusts of wind. Veronica stood behind Fjord. She asked the princess if she was really going to do what Frey asked. Fjord watched the scenery in the distance and answered Veronica's question by saying that she had to do this, because even the master said not to skimp on helping him. Veronica looked at Fjord's hair fluttering from side to side, asking if everything would really happen like Frey's words. Fjord turned her head a little, looking at Veronica. Teaching words came out of her mouth. She advised Veronica to remember her words. Sometimes it is possible to make the right decision only when you go beyond common sense. Fjord's gaze fixed on the main building of the Blake family. Her previous words were true. It is precisely such people, carrying the wind of change, who changed the world. There were mugs with a teapot on the dining table. At that time Lithia's voice was heard. She told Frey that he had made the right choice. Lesia stood up from her chair, leaning her hand on the table. All family members turned their gazes to her when Lesia, closing her eyes, called Frey a worthy successor to the Blake family. Lesia turned to Heinz, who was sitting opposite Frey. Heinz looked at his mother. Feeling some anger and indifference towards her, Lesia asked Heinz to tell Frey the secret of the Blake family. Isaka closed his eyes when Lesia announced that she would be waiting for Frey in the underground office. Transported to Heinz's office, the shelves of the closet are littered with a huge number of books. Frey had a table near the closet looking at books, while Heinz was sitting on a sofa nearby reading a book. Heinz assumed that he had nothing to tell Frey about, so he suggested that he rest a little and then he would go down to Leschia in about an hour. Frey, looking at the neatly arranged books on the shelves, ordered Hans to call Charles. Heinz, without looking up from reading the book, said that he would convey his message to her, but he did not know whether she would fulfill it. Heinz looked at Frey in surprise when he said that Charles would come. Heinz turned the book over and placed it on his lap. He himself looked at Frey, who turned around. Heinz looked at Frey standing next to the cabinets. Heinz suddenly thought about Frey's identity. But still, Heinz, looking at Frey with his violet pupils, threw his thoughts aside. Events are transferred to the dungeon of the Blake family mansion. Frey walked behind Leschia, listening as she asked about his feelings after learning the truth of this world. Frey pretended to be surprised, saying that he still could not fully comprehend everything. Leschia believed his feigned words and smiled. When Leschia reached the end of the corridor, she raised the screen leading to another room, telling Frey not to worry because he would slowly, one by one, learn all the details. Frey's eyes widened at what he saw. The bodies of the people lay on some kind of torture table, their bodies were securely attached, and pipes with a green liquid inside were attached to some parts of the body. Walking a little inside, you could see the torture room. The body of one person was suspended, his hands were in shackles attached to the ceiling. A terrifying smell spread from his body. Nearby on the table, you could even see his head separated from the body. Frey, entering the room, frozen in a stupor, he saw a man in a mask holding a subtype of a huge cleaver and cutting the body of one of the people. The question about the identity of these people was heard from his lips. Leschia, walking ahead, smirked at his behavior. Leschia extended her hand pointing at the bodies of people. She turned to Frey, telling Frey to get used to it, because these were just bodies for experiments. She showed Leschia past suspended and mummified bodies. One of the workers, wrapped in a cloak, picked up a flask with liquid and carefully examined it. But there was some strangeness in it. The old man had no pupils. The old man approached the test subject, whose face was horribly changed. A kind of shackles were put on his head, and a tube was attached to his mouth and to which the old man had just poured the mixture he had obtained. Frey and Leschia passed by workers at tables with experimental subjects. Along the way Leschia spoke about the identity of these workers. It turned out that they were all magicians and researchers who were members of the Blake family, and they were also researchers in this place. When Frey passed by one of the alchemists, he noticed the terrible condition of the worker. Frey jerked, looking at Lithia, who, with a smile on her face, told him that she had, in fact, taken away their ability to think. Frey, looking at Leschia's back, asked about the meaning of her words. She turned her head, advising her to remember her words well. Leschia continued walking, her face expressing her madness as she said that when leading a group, personal ego was just a work of detrimental poison, and the most effective and safest method was to force them, like machines, to follow orders. Frey's gaze was filled with anger. He squeezed and bit his lips from powerlessness and rage. Frey continued to follow Leschia through the Blake mansion dungeon. Leschia suddenly stopped, telling Frey, who was walking behind, that they had arrived. Frey and Leschia stood near a huge door decorated with golden patterns. Frey widened his eyes and fell into horror. He clearly felt the divine power emanating from the door. He was scared that the demigod inside was emitting incredible divine power. Leschia turned around and looked at Frey, warning him, telling him to watch his words. Leschia touched the door, glowing with incredible divine power, with her hand and said that their owner was behind it. Frey felt enormous pressure from the realization that Riran was behind the door. His pupils and eyes widened. Frey cursed in his thoughts. He assumed that Riran was in this house, but he could not even think that Leschia herself would personally lead him to Riran. Frey wondered if he would be able to avoid revealing himself even in such a situation. Frey stood in a stupor. His body did not move. There were too many disturbing factors. Indra's divine power taking place in his body could become a huge problem. Frey also remembered the items he kept with him. This was a mask taken from Hector and even a bead received from Rika. Leschia looked at Frey with a question, not understanding his shock and fear. At this time Frey understood that Riran could not help but guess about his identity. Frey scolded himself for not being able to predict such a possibility. Frey's eyes looked at the floor. He thought about escaping. But if he gave up now, all his plans would collapse like a box house. When Leshia turned to Frey, he flinched in surprise and looked at her. Leshia approached Frey and touched his face. She noticed his poor complexion and his strange behavior. Frey looked at Leshia, who was looking at him with concern. Frey decided to take the chance. Because if he was the first to end Leshia's life before Riren found out about his essence. Frey's face, to which Leshia put her hand, changed. He seemed to realize something. He told his mother that everything was fine with him. And his thoughts admiring the opportunity to personally kill the apocalypse, he decided to try because in any case it will be necessary someday to do. Leshia again approached the door and touched it, saying that everything would end quickly. Frey's face became serious. He must be able to carry out his plan. The huge doors swung open, revealing the figure of Riren sitting cross-legged on the throne. This time, Riren's face was missing a mask, so a vertical scar could be seen on her lips. She noticed that Leshia had arrived quite early. Riren put her hand to her face. Her pupils lit up when she saw Frey. She called him a cute baby and asked about his personality. Entering Riren's room, Leshia fell to her knees, bowed her head and raised her hands. Leshia, who fell to her knees in front of Riren, asked if everything was fine with her, calling her the mistress of the continent. All this time Frey stood, motionless, looking at Riren sitting on the throne. Frey bowed his head, his face dejected. Frey clenched his teeth. Frey knelt down, repeating Leshia's pose. Frey and Leshia lowered their hands and placed them on their laps. Leshia introduced Frey, calling Frey her third child. Riren, sitting on her blue throne, asked if Leshia actually had a third one. But quickly forgetting about this, she quickly asked about the matter that she entrusted to Leshia. Leshia fell into some horror and sadness, saying that there was only half left to achieve the goal. Riren got angry and waved her hand. Sheet, screaming, scolded Leshia for such a small supply of items received. Frey looked at Leshia, who had closed her eyes and began to say that they were currently preparing for Frey's engagement to the third princess. Leshia's lips curled into a smile, saying that if they made the princess their person, they could achieve their goal in no time. Riren closed her eyes and calmed down. But she noticed many problems associated with the princess. She remembered the owner of the 11th magic tower, who brought her so many problems. Frey exclaimed. His eyes trembled a little. He had heard the name Paragon for the first time. He assumed that she was talking about the ally that Cairo mentioned. Riren began to rise, resting her hand on the arms of her throne. Riren held the back of her head and approached Frey, calling him a taciturn child, although she admitted that this made him even cuter. Riren looked at Frey, who was sitting on his knees with his head bowed. Riren grabbed Frey's chin and lifted his head. Riren crouched in front of Frey. Looking at his facial features, she noted that the people's appearance was quite similar. Riren, who put her hand to Frey's throat, noticed something in Frey's energy. Riren's pupil narrowed as she noticed something surprising about Freyja. Riren grabbed Frey's hand with her hand. Riren's body began to glow due to the divine power she used. One of her hands squeezed Frey's throat, and the other held his hand. Frey closed his eyes and groaned. Riren brought her face closer to Freyja's. She was angry, and her pupil was shrinking so much that it could be compared to a pea. Frey clenched his teeth, realizing that he had been discovered. Frey looked at Lisha, who was horrified by what she saw. He needed to end Lithia's life at once. From such a short distance he could do it. Suddenly, Riren knocked Frey to the ground, and she climbed on top of him. Frey was lying on the floor. Riren was holding him. Climbing on his stomach, Lisha jumped up to the side from the unexpected outcome of events. At this time Frey realized that Riren was covering Lisha with her body. Riren's pupil began to glow brightly. With anger in her voice she asked if his name was really Frey. Frey's face was twisted in pain. He clenched his teeth trying to do something. Riren, from whom blue divine power emanated, sitting astride Frey and holding him by the throat, called him good raw material. Suddenly Lisha stood up, saying that Frey was more talented than even the eldest son Michael. Riren looked at Lisha with anger. Riren looked at Frey. Her lips parted when she said that she needed to talk to her mother, so he should have stepped aside. Frey, thinking that he had not been discovered, immediately began to deny it. Because even now Riren continued to cover Lisha with her body, This was proof that she had guessed who he was and was protecting Lisha. When Riran let Frey go, Frey, who fell into horror, did not understand the reason for this. He approached in front of Frey, who began to rise, and asked him if he had trouble perceiving information by ear. Frey, understanding her hint, immediately stood up and left. Riran and Lisha stood up and looked after Frey as he left. Riran waved her hand at Frey, saying that they would definitely see each other again. Soon, Riran began to lower her hand, the atmosphere suddenly changing. Riran, without turning around, asked Lisha, who was standing behind, whether Frey had already received his divine powers. Lisha was surprised and only began to say that he had not yet received his powers. How Riran turned around sharply after hearing her words. Riran grabbed Lisha by the throat with her hand. The demigod lifted Lisha's body off the ground with one hand and called her stupid. Veins stood out on Riran's face, anger filled her completely. If Lisha weren't her apostle, she would have killed her right here, tearing her to shreds. Riran threw Lisha into one of the laboratory instruments, which immediately collapsed after colliding with Lisha. Riran radiated terrifying divine power. She looked at Lisha lying on the wreckage of the equipment and reminded that only fools make mistakes. Riran's eyes glowed and she angrily asked if Lisha was stupid. Lisha held her throat and began to stand up, denying Riran's words. At this time, Frey drew a formation on the floor with his finger. Frey crouched and drew a formation for the summoning. Realizing that Riran could not help but notice the divine power of Indra within him, there could only be one reason why. Even despite this, she did not do anything with him. Frey's eyes widened and the whole world turned into complete darkness when Frey realized that Riran was not inactive but simply could not do anything. Frey opened his mouth in shock. A drop of sweat ran down his face. After thinking carefully, he realized that even now, at this moment, the mortally wounded apocalypses continued to recover, and if Riran provided the enormous divine power they needed, then now she was incredibly weak. Frey continued to draw the summoning circle, finally realizing that the current Riran was a weak shell of her former self. This explained why she was stalling for time. Having finished drawing, Frey raised his finger, the tip of which was covered in ink. Frey stood up after finishing drawing the formation. He had to take advantage of the fact that Riran was weak and there would never be such a chance to get rid of her again. Frey turned around as the door to his room swung open and light entered his room. Heinz walked into his room and was stunned when he saw the formation on the floor. Heinz, with a look of shock on her face, asked Frey about the purpose of the formation. Frey looked at Heinz with a stern look and announced that today he was going to kill Lisha. Heinz's mouth opened in surprise, but he soon came to his senses and covered his mouth with his hand and closed his eyes. Heinz approached Frey, saying that he understood that his mother turned out to be an apostle of Riran. Frey looked at Heinz with a serious face. Heinz bowed his head a little, feeling sad. Soon he raised his head, looked at Lucas and spoke about his thoughts, which were confirmed. It turned out that he really was not Frey. Heinz, looking a little angrily at Lucas, demanded to tell him what happened to his younger brother. Lucas's lips parted as he asked if Heinz was wrong in calling Frey his younger brother. Lucas grabbed Heinz's clothes with his hands. Lucas was angry again. He brought the shocked Heinz closer to him, saying that he pronounced these words very well with his dirty mouth. When Heinz heard the news of Frey's death, his pupils increased in size. An angry Frey confronted Heinz, saying that it was he and his family who killed poor Frey. Lucas screamed, asking Heinz if he could even imagine how Frey lived. Lucas remembered how Frey was knocked to the ground, kicked and beaten, ignored and trampled by everyone who existed in his life. Lucas replayed Frey's memories in his mind. Frey cried very hard when his own family abandoned him and Heinz along with her. Lucas even imagined the scene of Frey falling to his knees and holding a jar of pills and drugs in his hands. That child who, from birth, had not approved of himself for a minute, not even a second. Frey's hands were shaking, but he continued to hold the bottle of drugs inside. This cruel loneliness and terrible pain he could only give up in the continuation of his life. Heinz, who was shouted at by Lucas and told about all Frey's suffering, could not utter a word. His eyes widened and his mouth opened in shock. Lucas clenched his jaw while holding Heinz's clothes, at which point Heinz asked him if Frey had committed suicide. Suddenly Lucas flinched when he heard Frey's voice. As if a child, Frey wrapped his arms around Lucas, asking him not to beat up his older brother because he was sure that he also had his reasons. Lucas looked at Frey's face, who closed his eyes and his lips trembled, seeing as Lucas called Frey a soft-hearted idiot. Lucas pushed Heinz away, throwing him to the floor. Looking at Heinz, who was sitting on the floor, Lucas said that someone like him didn't even have the right to be sad. Heinz was trembling. He bit his lower lip in agreement with Lucas. Heinz closed his eyes and gritted his teeth as he talked about how he hoped that at least Frey would get out of this hell. Lucas looked at Heinz in surprise as he began to take off his outer clothing. Lucas exclaimed, his mouth falling open in amazement at what he saw. At this time, far away in the mountainous region of Livendark, where vegetation was rarely found. Instead, various stone sculptures rose above the ground. At the very top of Mount Roxo, Lord stood in the center of the golden formation, energizing 3 altars representing the 3 wounded apocalypses. Golden energy came out of the Lord's body and was absorbed by the sphere of fire on one altar and the scorpion sculpture on the other. The Lord suddenly turned around, sensing someone's approach. Blue energy flashed behind the Lord. The Lord, without turning around, asked Rurin, who was standing behind him, about what had happened, and she notified him of the problem that had arisen. Looking at the back of Lord Rurin's head, she told how a man appeared who possessed Indra's lightning, and although she was not sure who he was, an eye appeared on the Lord's face as he said Ricky's name. Rurin stood motionless, noting the importance of this event. Without turning around, the Lord ordered her to catch him alive, but Rurin leaned forward and resisted. She shouted about the difficulty of this action. Rurin looked at the skull that was lying on the altar and explained that due to the fact that she was now taking out all her strength to treat the demigods, she was weak, like an empty shell. Rurin looked away and gritted her teeth, admitting that she was scared, but she was disgusted due to the fact that she was shaking with horror in front of some people. The Lord standing in the center of the formation reassured her by saying that he would send her support. Then Rurin, placing her hand on her side, asked how many he was going to send. Introducing the city of Caskel, the Lord spoke about 3 demigods who were near this city, but they did not know how to use time-spatial movement, so it would be necessary to wait 3 days before their arrival. Rurin thought, stroking her lower face, she decided to start evacuating Leisha. Events take us back to the Blake family mansion. Heinz took off all his outer clothing, revealing a body covered in many scars. Rurin sat motionless, his clothes lying on the floor, while Lucas examined his entire body. Lucas was horrified at the sight of Heinz's body, who began to talk about a physical body that embodied the harmony of divine power in mana and had been used as a model for research since birth. Heinz lowered his head as he told Lucas that being born into this family with abilities was tantamount to living as a test subject for the rest of your life. As Heinz began to put his clothes back on, a shocked Lucas asked if Mitchell had been through this, and Heinz immediately confirmed it. Looking at the formation, Heinz said that Mitchell's character underwent dramatic changes after this. In the end he became what he is now. This was very logical. Because if he had not been seized by a false sense of superiority and thoughts of being the chosen one, he would not have been able to withstand this hell on earth. Heinz, putting on his sleeveless jacket, said that it was he who made it so that Frey could not use mana. Lucas was shocked by what he heard. He didn't even immediately understand the meaning of Heinz's words. Heinz recalled the day Freyja was born with a saddened look, then Freyja's small hand grabbed Hans's finger. Heinz wanted to protect the angelic smile of his little brother, who was squeezing his finger with his small hands. Looking at little Frey and his smile, he wanted to free Frey from the torment that he himself had experienced, so he polluted the vein of mana in this child's body. Lucas's eyes widened after hearing this. Lucas remembered his movement into this body, this incompatibility that he felt the very first time he moved into the body. Only now Lucas understood the reason for that feeling, similar to as if someone had artificially cut off his blood circulation. Heinz hunched over, talking about how he thought that if Frey was not in this damned family, he could live happily. Lucas stood opposite Heinz, who was sitting, who recalled what a kind and gentle child Frey was. He was called a disgrace to the family, so he probably could not think of a way not to harm his family. Lucas listened with a look of surprise on his face as Heinz called Freyja fool for his choice. Covering one eye with his hand, Heinz cried and asked Frey for forgiveness for his inattention. Lucas stood motionless. He could hear Frey crying inside him. Lucas looked at the crying Heinz while Frey cried inside him because he was grateful to his brother. He pitied him and apologized for his weakness. Heinz wiped his tears with his hand, asking for an answer to his question. Lucas fixed his gaze on Heinz, listening to his question. He asked who was standing in front of him. Lucas turned away and went to the window, saying that even if he told about his identity, Heinz would not believe it. Heinz suddenly shuddered when he heard the voice of Charles, who said that her master was a man with whom he did not deserve to even meet eyes. A dark portal formed next to them, from which dark mana began to flow. Lucas and Heinz watched as many bats flew out of the portal. Soon the bats merged and Charles appeared in front of him. Heinz gaped in amazement, because not even a few hours had passed since he sent the message, but she ran here without stopping. Charles knelt in front of Lucas, forcing Heinz about her attitude that she expressed to Lucas. Heinz jumped up and asked Charles why she called Frey her master. Charles did not turn around, saying that he would find out everything himself when the time came. Charles looked at Heinz and ordered him to follow them. Heinz lowered his gaze. He did not understand what was happening at all, but decided to obey. Lucas approached Heinz and asked him for a request. Heinz looked at Lucas trying to pronounce the name of the metal that Lucas had just told him about. Lucas, standing opposite Heinz, said that this metal was necessary for the demigods to capture the continent and Reborn received it with the help of Lisha. Lucas looked at Heinz asking him to look for him. Heinz, standing opposite Lucas, expressed his understanding. He said that if his mother was hiding him, there were several places that he suspected. He promised to try to search for them. Charles closed her eyes when Lucas asked her to find Lisha. Charles took his request as an order and agreed. Lucas patted Charles on the head, warning her of danger. Charles was embarrassed by his actions and looked at Lucas in amazement. Charles, whose head he was stroking, Lucas excitedly said that it would be nice if she had a clue by which she could be tracked. Heinz looked at Launder Charles, blushing with embarrassment like a little girl, talking about Lisha who? In her opinion, despite what was happening here and was hiding the presence of her energy, she regretted that she could not cause at least a little hesitation. Charles raised her head sharply when Lucas said that it would be easy to cause hesitation. A predatory smile appeared on Lucas' face. A powerful explosion occurred in the Blake mansion. Fragments and dust flew in different directions. Suddenly, a powerful explosion was heard in the estate. Hanging in the air, the main character watched the emerging cloud of smoke. Wary, deep in his thoughts, Lucas noted that if his assumptions were correct, then Reborn would definitely go call for reinforcements. At that moment, towering in the sky, Heinz flew forward. Continuing to think, Lucas noted that he did not have time. Charles's face was full of seriousness. The main character thought that he needed to find aluminum at least 1 minute or even a second faster. A crash was heard above the destroyed building. Pointing to Lucas hovering nearby, his father called him a brat. Beside himself with rage, he wondered what the main character was doing. Smirking, Lucas noted that he didn't know it, asking what it was like. Screaming, his father called him impudent, asking what motivated him to say such things in front of him. Putting his hands forward, the main character created a magical barrier around himself. Frightened, his father thought that Mono was not responding. With a look of disgust, Lucas ordered him not to try to pretend to be a father, stating that it made him sick. In his thoughts, his father was amazed that the main character was an 8-star mage. Pushing away from the magical barrier, continuing to think, his father called it impossible, saying that Lucas had captured the space. Baring his teeth, the father tried to escape. A huge block of ice appeared in front of his face. Looking at his father landing on the rock, Luca noted that he was Reborn's puppet, which made him think that the divine power would be the wind. Lucas's eyes sparkled with particles of bright aura. The ice block on which his father stood collapsed into small pieces. After which, his father began to fall down. A loud crash was heard from his fall. Turning around, the main character noted that looking at his father now, he understands that he, apparently, does not even reach the level of a puppet. Trying to get up, his father assumed that he had returned here from the very beginning for such a purpose. Smirking, Lucas said that this was true, asking why else he would return to such a terrible family. Stretching his hand forward, his father considered that he had made a mistake by saying that he should not have kicked out such a brat like Lucas then. Screaming, the father said that he should have killed the main character right there, noting that he should not have been born. Raising his hand, he froze in one position. Many monsters appeared behind Lucas. Wings were visible behind their backs. Turning around, the main character stated the way his father says it. Looking at the floating monsters that were created by Reborn, Lucas noted that his father had strange preferences, asking if they were flies or people. After which, a horde of monsters rushed to attack. Raising his hand in front of his face, the main character created an ice wall. Suddenly, the ice wall broke into small particles. The entire floor was covered in strong poison. Looking around, Lucas was amazed that the spell had disappeared. Smirking, the father wondered if the protagonist dared to think that he could use ice magic in front of him. Flying towards it, Lucas theorized that it was a form of divine power. An army of monsters appeared on the path of the main character. Further, this army surrounded Lucas from all sides. With a serious expression on his face, the father ordered the protagonist to look, saying that this was the power of divine powers, noting that no matter how he floundered, he could not surpass it. Looking at his stunned father, Lucas wondered if he was talking about authority. A stream of radiant aura gradually began to form in the sky. Then, a powerful explosion was heard in the air. The father was shocked by what he saw. Hanging in the air, the main character wondered why his father possessed divine powers. Lucas' face was filled with genuine hatred. Surrounded by many rats, Charles was lost in her own thoughts. Looking ahead, she ordered them to find LeChub Lake. After which, a horde of rats fled in different directions. Looking around the place where the rats were running, in her thoughts, Charles said that the Blake family estate was destroyed, which is why she felt the energy of vibrations, albeit very slightly. A large black rat was sitting on the rubble of one of the buildings. Continuing to think, she reported that by combining with the senses of reconnaissance spirits, she would be able to determine her location. Closing her eyes, Charles began to explore the city. Her eyes were shrouded in streams of red. Seeing LeChub, who was in the center of the magic seal, Charles declared that she had found her. At the depths of the dungeon, human bodies were visible, hanging upside down, shouting something. Raising her hands, LeChub began to recite some kind of spell. The place where the ceremony took place was shrouded in a purple glow. While in the rat's shadow, Charles noted that LeChub had sacrificed living people and was maximizing the spell's effectiveness, wondering what she was planning to do. The magic seals on the floor began to glow. Lifting her head, LeChub continued to whisper the spell. A portal opened before her eyes. Someone's foot appeared from the depths of the portal. Looking at the unknown man who had just arrived, LeChub greeted him, addressing him as Mr. Epheb. Bowing her head, she announced that her name was LeChub Lake. With a look of disgust, Epheb noted that it was a dirty place. Continuing to bow her head, LeChub stated that she was very sorry that she had brought him to such an unkempt place, saying that Reborn had ordered him to hide. Drawing attention to the hanging corpses nearby, Epheb stated that LeChub sacrificed people and called him, who was a superintelligence. Charles continued to peek out from the depths of the shadow, watching them. Epheb noted that if he were heading here on his own, it would have taken about 3 days, stating that he almost felt incredibly sad. Further, he called Apostle Reborn amazing. In her thoughts, Charles noted the presence of the demigod, stating that as Lucas said, they were gathering reinforcements. Flunging into the shadows, she thought that she needed to report this to the main character. LeChub said that she would be able to bring the remaining 2 gentlemen before dawn. Continuing to think, Charles said that even if it was a demigod, he would not be able to notice her movements with the help of a shadow. Lowering her head, LeChub revealed that the target was her 3rd son, Frey Blake. Kneeling, she assumed that the main character had already begun to act, which is why Epheb needed to hurry. Interrupting her, Epheb asked her not to rush him, noting that she was becoming even more despondent. Stretching his hand forward, the demigod focused his attention on something. Next, he waved his hand. A stunned Charles appeared from the depths of the shadow. Horrified, she was amazed that she had been noticed. Looking at the annoyed Epheb, continuing to think, she noted that the shadows were inside the barrier of darkness. In turn, Epheb wondered what kind of mouse had come here, calling the situation. Heinz was shocked by what he saw. His gaze fell on the ruins of the building. In front of his face could be seen many hanging corpses, their faces covered with bags. Heinz noted that he expected this, adding that he did not think it was that bad. Approaching the door, he said that aluminum was produced here. Pulling back the curtain, Heinz entered the room. Wary, he froze in one position. A bookcase caught his eye. Using the book in his hands, Heinz thought that these were materials closely related to him, surprised at the method of production. One of the pages depicted the components that were needed to summon a demigod. Frightened, Heinz called it madness. A powerful stream of aura emanated from Father Lucas' body. Lying on the rubble of a stone, he let out a terrifying scream. The moment Heinz approached the main character, he turned around. Holding the bag in his hands, Heinz said that he had found it, adding that this bag of space unification contained everything. Looking at his angry father, Heinz declared that this was aluminum. Next, the father wondered why Heinz was there, after which, he handed the bag into Lucas' hands. Having opened it, the main character noted the huge quantity. Baring his teeth, the father said that he could not believe that even he sided with the main character. Looking at Lucas, Heinz wondered how much he knew about aluminum materials. Lowering his gaze, he said that he also only knew that Harkin was in him. Lowering his hands, Heinz asked Lucas to tell him what power was contained in this substance called aluminium. Turning around, the main character tried to find out if Heinz knew what the only thing the demigods were afraid of was. Looking at the surprised Heinz, Lucas told him about the invisible force that protected the order of the world. Standing surrounded by the rubble of buildings, the protagonist told Heinz about God. Heinz was shocked by what he heard. Further, Lucas wondered if Heinz had words, noting that demigods pretend to be gods themselves. An image of Agni appeared in his head, whose body was shrouded in flames. The main character noted the improbability of the fact that in reality they live separately from each other, adding that for demigods who commit senseless murders, there is a god who can punish them with destruction. In Lucas's hand was a piece of aluminum, bringing it to his face. The main character said that if you eat it, you can completely hide your divine abilities, noting that in other words, it is a miracle cure thanks to which demigods no longer need to fear God. Heinz clenched his hands into fists and considered what this meant. Interrupting him, Lucas said that this was so. Wary, the main character stated that the demigods were going to, using aluminum, close God's eyes and take over the continent. Baring his teeth, Heinz noted that this runs in their family. His fist was shaking due to the intense tension. Looking at the stunned Lucas, Heinz said that among the ingredients of aluminum were human hearts. Looking at his father lying on the floor, Heinz stated that it takes 108 pieces to create only 0.1 kilograms, noting that the aluminum he found in the laboratory exceeds tens of kilograms. An image of a palace in the dungeon of which was all strewn with bones appeared in his head. Heinz revealed that this is the true identity of the Blake family. Turning to his lying father, he wondered how many people he had sacrificed. Baring his teeth, his father called Heinz a brat, noting that he did not feel at all grateful for being raised. Interrupting him, Heinz ordered him to answer. With a stunned expression on his face, Heinz tried to find out where he had brought such a huge number of people from. Staring into space, the father was lost in his own thoughts. An image appeared in his head of him handing over money to some stranger. The father said that there are quite a lot of parents in the world who sell their children for one piece of silver. Hearing this, the main character turned away, after which, his father noted that these children were simply subordinates in any case, saying that even after the sale, no one would worry about them and no one would have problems because of this. Beside himself with rage, Heinz called out to his father. He, in turn, asked him not to be a hypocrite. Smirking, his father noted that in any case, Heinz's body also has the blood of the Blake family. Clenching his fist, Heinz froze in one position. Drawing attention to the surprised Heinz, the protagonist stated that this blood flows in him too. Clasping his hands, Lucas wondered what his father meant by this. Taken aback, Heinz turned to the main character. Their father's face was filled with anger. Averting his gaze, Heinz reported that Lucas was right. With a serious expression on his face, he stated that the Blake family must disappear. Screaming, the father called them pathetic worms, after which, the main character grabbed his hand. Baring his teeth, Lucas wondered if it was time for his father to say what he needed to say, asking where Reborn was. Frowning, his father asked rhetorically whether Lucas thought he would answer. The main character, in turn, noted that he should remain silent. Squeezing his hand, Lucas noted that if his father said this right away, it would greatly upset him. Suddenly, a cloud of light aura appeared in the air. From what he saw, the main character was shocked. Due to an unimaginably powerful push, Lucas was thrown to the side. Heinz's face was shrouded in bewilderment. The body of the beaten Charles was visible in the arms of the protagonist. At that moment, beside himself with rage, Lucas raised his head. His gaze was attracted by Epheb standing next to him, who suggested that he had some business with Reborn, noting that if he wanted, he could tell everything. With bloody streaks on her face, Charles asked Lucas to be careful, adding that Epheb was in control of darkness. Looking at the wary protagonist, Charles said that there was no point in hiding from him inside the shadow. Being in Lucas's arms, she said that she needed to run quickly, saying that 2 more would arrive before dawn. Looking at the exhausted Charles, the main character noted that she did a great job, asking her to get a good rest, adding that he would finish everything himself. Handing her over to Heinz, Lucas asked him to take care of her. Horrified, Heinz wondered if the main character was going to confront the demigod alone. In turn, Lucas said that he didn't really, but was going to. Paying attention to the back of the main character, Heinz tried to call him. Turning around, Lucas froze in one position. With a serious expression on his face, Heinz asked him not to die. Epheb's face was shrouded in contempt. Presented before the main character, he called the situation dull. Preparing to attack, Lucas used his technique to summon Shuei's staff. With upset eyes, the main character stared into emptiness and froze in one place. Mr. Epheb declared in his thoughts that he was a demigod using the power of darkness. To which I asked a question towards Lucas, he is a magician. Epheb said that Ririn still became much weaker, she was shaking with fear because of such a person, how sad. Lucas gathers magic mana to attack. The main character directed a magical attack towards Epheb. Epheb began to gather dark magical power in his hand. With a wave of his hand, Epheb used his dark force technique. Looking at the man, Lucas noted in his thoughts that everything around him became as light as day, adding that it was as if he had absorbed the surrounding darkness. Lucas, angry, continued to look at Epheb's, then suggested in his thoughts that this was the power over darkness. Shrouded in darkness, Epheb watched Lucas piercingly. Using his technique, Epheb summoned black holes behind him. Then the Lord of Darkness summoned spears and pointed them towards Lucas. The main character caused a strong barrier with his technique, thereby fighting off the spears. Spears pierced this barrier. Lucas noted in his thoughts that this barrier was completely unyielding, then suggested that Epheb was really ignoring the laws of physics. The main character caused a magical explosion of lava with his technique and sent it towards Epheb where a powerful explosion occurred. The Lord of Darkness blocked Lucas' attack, using his robe as protection. Epheb, straightening his robe, noted that his attack was dull. At this time, Lucas, looking at him, noted in his thoughts that this was a battle with a demigod. Epheb again directed his spears towards Lucas, thereby the main character, flying away from them, dodged. Dodging the spears, Lucas noted in his thoughts that the power of darkness was a complete headache. Having landed on the ground, the main character suddenly made a dash in the other direction. In an instant, an earthquake began, where a fight took place between Epheb and the main character. With his magical technique, Lucas summoned a stone wall. The spears of the demigod of darkness were stuck into this wall. He extended his hand towards the main character. Epheb laughed and noted that this was useless resistance. Collecting his magical mana, the main character noted in his thoughts that he did not know to what extent the laws of physics would apply to Epheb, adding that he would try to respond with white magic. With his magical technique, the main character summoned a holy breath, which he directed towards Epheb. The demigod tried to repel the main character's attack with his technique. Lucas' attack and Epheb's blocking caused a magical explosion. Seeing this explosion, Lucas noted in his thoughts that this was the energy of the explosion that came from the collision of light and darkness. The main character's face was shocked by what he saw. Epheb, looking at Lucas, noted that it was fun. The energy from the explosion made a hole in the demigod's body, to which the demigod noted that he liked the main character. The hole in Epheb's body was covered with a purple magical aura. Using his technique, the demigod, with the help of a hole, began to absorb all the light that was near him. By spreading his arms and absorbing the light, the demigod was healed. An angry Lucas noted that he still uses the surrounding darkness as a source of energy, adding that this is an amazing talent. Epheb, with a magical aura flying around him, gave a positive answer, adding that until the pitch darkness dissipates, his power will be close to infinite. With a thoughtful look, Lucas suggested that even when the darkness dissipates, as many as 2 other demigods will come here. Raising his hand, the demigod wondered if Lucas was desperate. Using his technique, Epheb summoned and aimed his spears at Lucas. The main character dodged the spears with lightning speed, then flew away from the others. Lucas, looking at the demigod, noted in his thoughts that his left hand goes as an attack and his right as a defense. Continuing to think, the main character suggested in his thoughts that he would have a chance of winning if his right hand was immobilized right before he began to defend himself. Seeing the approaching attack, the protagonist's face was shocked. Lucas noted in his mind that if he attacked in the dark, he would immediately recover. The main character dodged the demigod's attack with lightning speed. An angry Lucas noted in his thoughts that the demigod's attacks were becoming a little more violent, then wondered what he should do. At this time, Heinz was holding Charles by the armpits. After watching the fight between Lucas and Epheb, Heinz noted in his mind that he was so good at fighting against the demigod alone, adding that this was a level that he himself could not even imagine. A voice came from behind Heinz Blake, calling him foolish. Glancing back, Heinz saw that it was his bound father who had spoken, who then wondered what he was doing. Holding Charles and looking at her, Heinz noted that he was now thinking about what to do best, to which the bound Osaka called his son a scoundrel. Bloodied Charles, barely breathing, noted that she did not give a chance. Looking at her, Heinz shouted her name. Getting up, Lander crawled towards Osaka, smiling, she said his name. Heinz then noted that she was not allowed to move yet. Charles crawled towards Osaka, then took his head with both hands and noted that it was a sin of betrayal of this world, then added that there was a chance to atone for this sin. In her fangs, Charles began to bite him. Having bitten, Lander absorbed all of Osaka's mana while he screamed in pain. Opening his mouth very wide, Osaka continued to scream in pain. Osaka's body was covered with a red magical aura, after which he began to dry out from blood loss. After sucking the blood, Osaka remained kneeling in one position, with his mouth open. Standing up, Charles began to wipe the blood from her mouth. Surprised, Heinz, shouting, suggested that she had killed his father, to which Lander noted that he should not worry because she did not kill him. The vampire spread her huge wings and Heinz was surprised by what he saw. With her back to Blake, Charles noted that she needed to help the master, then asked him to cover her. Using her wings, she flew to fight a February. At this time, before he could say anything, Heinz shouted her name. Heinz was approached by Leisha, who noted that she was truly disappointed in him. Looking at Blake, the woman wondered how he could succumb to Frey's deception and betray their family. At this time, Heinz turned to his mother. Trying to deceive, Leisha, looking at her son, told him to come to his senses because all Frey's words were pure lies, to which Heinz gave a negative answer. An angry Heinz noted that he himself was disappointed in his family and in himself. Making a menacing look, Leisha noted that they would no longer be able to agree with words. At this time, Lucas was dodging the demigod's attacks. The shocked protagonist noted in his thoughts that they would spend the whole night like this, adding that if only there was time, he would stretch out this fight. Meanwhile, Charles flew up to Lucas and told her master to leave the demigod to her, to which the main character was surprised by her appearance. Looking at the vampire, Lucas wondered if she was okay, to which Charles noted that she had never been so grateful for being a vampire as she is today. Standing in front of Charles, the protagonist stated that he was glad that she had recovered, but this was not an opponent with whom she could do anything. Lander noted that she had an idea. Lucas was surprised by what he heard, then wondered what the idea was. Looking at the demigod, Charles noted that if her plan worked, then they would be able to get rid of a February. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button for more epic manhwa recaps.